Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Building a Family Business here on Builder Funnel Radio. Wes Brooks, how's it going today?
Doing
Good.
great. Thanks, Vince.
Good, good. Well, we're deep into COVID-19, and so we've just been commenting on all of our different hair lengths. So if you're listening to this via audio, sorry, you can't we have zero context here. But for those of you watching the video, basically, Wes and I have not been gifted with lots of hair, and Brooks has. So
I've got lots of it.
he's got all the leverage right now.
Yeah, yeah.
But,
And all the lucky genes in the family.
Yep.
Yeah.
Get the flowing locks, you know.
yeah. Well, what are you reading these days?
I did not read a thing this week. I spent the week with my chainsaw just cutting up brush in my yard and hauling it. I have a very long yard. I haul it from the very back to the very front and cut it up and put it in my dump trailer. And so that's kind of occupied my time. No reading this week.
Nice. No reading. Needed a break. Yeah,
No reading.
that's good.
Yeah.
How about you, Wes?
Well, that's funny that Brooks mentioned that. I have also been out on the property clearing scrub oak and trimming that all up. We have a big pickup coming up pretty soon for fire mitigation. So anyway, but I have done a little bit of reading. I'm reading, I just started Persuasion by Robert Cialdini. I think that's the right way to pronounce it. Cialdini.
I'm sure he'll email in and correct us.
What's that? Yeah,
I'm sure he'll email in and correct us.
It'll be, we'll put it in the notes or something. Really good book. He's a well-known expert in the field of influence. And and he's got another book that he wrote a number of years ago called Influence. I think that's back in the early 90s or something that he wrote that. That's a good place to start, but this Persuasion is pretty darn good.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You guys have been doing a lot of work out in the yards or on the properties. I don't have much of a yard, but I was doing a workout and I had followed this guy, I think Wes, that you had recommended to me a while back, big in the lifting space, and he said, hey, you can still grow muscles with smaller weights if you just work till failure. And not being able to go to the gym right now, I said, okay, well, I'll try to do a failure workout. And I can barely type. I can't even, open lids or do anything. So I think I did something wrong, but I don't feel bad for either of you at all because I feel like you're still functioning and I can't function. So
the joys of lactic acid buildup.
Yeah.
Hey, no worries, Spencer. As you get older, you can't open lids anyway, so you just got there early. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm having to deal with that challenge early on.
You gotta work on your forearm strength.
Yeah, I'll just get some of those 45s and just walk around the neighborhood with them. But anyway, today we're not going to talk about all that garbage. We're going to talk about actually a kind of a case study and a project that you guys worked through. I don't actually know the exact timeline, but we'll dig into that. But I thought it would be helpful in light of some of our past discussions around metrics and returns and investment, and how do you think through when a project looks like it's going to be a good one to go through, and then what are those checkpoints along the way? I know you guys have said, hey, sometimes you get in and you've got all this money into it, so you get scared to leave. So we can talk about some of those things. But I guess, Brooks, what was this project? How did you come up with the idea? Kind of give us the lay of the land here.
Sure. Well, we had a project that had potential for, we believed, anywhere from 20 to 30 units, and we weren't really sure what that size would be. So you always have to start with any project with a pro forma. And a pro forma is, how do you believe something will work? And that's one of the things Wes is really good at doing, is pro formas. And so the pro forma has some critical parts, which are, what do you think the return on investment will be? What do you think the cost will be? What do you think interest rates will be, and cap rate? So Wes, I want to jump in there on some of the lender side of cap rates and interest
Sure.
rates.
Yeah, we can talk about this stuff. But I think, let's take a step back from that even maybe and just think about, you have to have an idea, right? So, you're driving around, you're looking at property, you're out at your projects or something, and you see a piece of land. And I think in our family, that's always kind of what started it, is someone saw a piece of land, right, Brooks? You see something you like and think, oh, either we could build some single family stuff on it, or, oh, that might be a good apartment site, something like that. And go, oh, that's a potential opportunity. And so in terms of the pro forma, that is usually where we start, but it doesn't have to be a sophisticated pro forma right off the bat. We always kind of make fun in our family of, using the back of the napkin. So, you flip over the napkin, you start scratching out some numbers and say, hey, does this even make a little bit of sense? Should I even pursue this to the next step? So I think let's just talk about apartments.
What goes on the napkin? Yeah, I'm curious.
What goes on the napkin? Well,
you really start out with rents. You start out with rent. In this case, and again, because we're talking about investment property, and it could be a single family home, it could be a site that would hold a certain number of units, or it could be an existing building, and you say, gee, this building looks underutilized, it might have potential for redevelopment, and unless you're going to use that building for your own company, you're really going to be renting it out to somebody else. So the first thing you got to figure out is, well, hey, what do I think I can rent these for? I think that's the first thing that goes on the napkin.
Absolutely. And I think if you think about this project really as a business, so just like your business, you have a P&L that you do for yourself every month. Hopefully you're doing it every month, if not at least once a quarter, but you're going, hey, like Brooks said, what's my revenue side? What am I going to bring in? And that's your rents in this particular case. So if this building is a mini business, then you're going to have to say, what's my potential revenue stream? Who are my customers? Who are my renters? So you start there and you go, well, what's everything else renting for around in the neighborhood? So you're going to check your rents, and you can do that yourself. You might have a good sense of it. You might have a few other rentals in the area, possibly. Or you can hire an outside firm to go check all the rents for you. Or you can check with your real estate agents and okay, what are 1 bedrooms going for? What are studios going for? What are 2 bedrooms going for? How does my potential location compare to everybody else's? And I'm going to adjust up and down from that. So you got to give yourself a revenue range. So that's the top line. So Brooks, what's the next line?
So the next line then is obviously expenses. And for apartments, you can use 30 to 35% expense ratio. And what that means is if you have $100,000 in gross rents, $35,000 will go to expenses just to pay property taxes, insurance, property management, repairs, maybe some utilities. So that's a good, everybody's market's different. I mean, in some markets, it could be 50%. In some markets, it could be 20%. So it's understanding what that expense ratio is in your market. And you can just get industry standards to start with. I mean, you can quickly Google, apartment expense ratios in your town, and you're going to get a range. It'll be close enough, for the back of the napkin. So that's where you get all those numbers. And when you take your gross revenue and subtract your expenses, that's your net income. And then that becomes the important thing, which goes back to then, what can you borrow and things like that. So Wes, after net income.
So I think, so a couple of things too. One thing, as you're talking about that, Brooks, I forgot to mention, which is you're going to start with your rental rule, but let's assume that you've got 10 units. Okay, you're going to do 10 units, and they're going to rent for $1,500 a piece. So what's that? $15,000, right? $15,000 a month, right?
That's right.
We're all good at math.
15,000. So 15,000. Yeah. So $180,000 a year. Okay. So
it's important to always into monthly and then annualized, because the annualization is what the lenders will look at. They're looking at your annual number. So
exactly right. So you got $180,000. but that's in a perfect world, and we don't live in a perfect world. So you have to add, a typical bank is going to say, they're going to look at your napkin and go, okay, well, you're not going to be full 100% of the time. And so industry standard is to show either a 5% or 7% vacancy. Now, in specific markets, they might allow something a little bit higher, a little bit less, but typically that's kind of industry standard. So you're going to take 5% of your gross rents right off the bat and say, you know what, people are going to come and go, they're going to move out, they're going to move in, and I'm going to lose some revenue in that churn process. So I've got 180,000. We're going to take 5% off of that, which would be, what's that?
It's going to give you 171,000 in revenue after vacancy.
Off for that. So 171,000. Then you're going to say, as Brooks said, what's my expenses? Let's take 35%. Brooks is running the calculator here. So,
well, I was going to use 30%, you switch to 35.
Yeah.
So
okay.
60,000 would be 35%.
Okay. And so that leaves you 111,000 after that. And so that is your net operating income, NOI. And this is your key number that you are really trying to get to, because this is the number that the lender is going to look at to determine how much that they're going to lend to you, and that's going to be based on what the property is now worth. So I think on previous programs we've talked about net operating income. It's really just an income stream, and so that has some sort of a value. So you're going to say, well, what's the value of my income stream of $111,000 on this project? And so you're going to go back to Google, right, Brooks, and look up what are your cap rates for apartments in your area. And once again, cap rate just stands for capitalization rate, or how much capital would I need to have in order to produce this amount of net operating income. Okay, so we're going to just do backwards math, and we're going to say 111,000. And I don't know, Brooks, what should we use for our
let's use a capitalization rate of 5%. It's kind of typical and then you take 111,000 divided by 5%. That gives you 2.2 million in value.
So 2.2 million in value. So that's great. So now we have something that we can talk to the bank about. We can say, we have this piece of property. We think we can put 10 units on it. We can have this kind of revenue. It's going to have this type of net operating income. And based on industry standards in our area with this cap rate, we think it's worth 2.2 million. And then the bank is going to say, what they think that they will lend on it. And so this is where I'm going to kick it back over to Brooks, because he is our banker guru. So
that I am. So the key thing to remember is your variables as you work through this process on the napkin are rents. Yep. If you're wrong on your assumption on rents, values could either be, the value of the building could be lower or higher. No use arguing about occupancy rate, industry standards, 5%. That's just what the bank's going to lend on. Don't bother, trying to worry about that. Expense ratio, the bank's going to use industry standard for expense ratio for apartment buildings. So that 30 to 35%, they might tweak it a little bit, but it's not worth trying to get wrapped around the axle at this point, because at the end of the day, the bank's going to underwrite the deal and they decide all those things. So you get back to, we have this value of 2.2 million for this project based on the income stream. And the bank's going to look at two things. They're going to look at a loan to value number, and they're going to look at a loan to cost. So LTV, loan to value, and LTC, loan to cost. Now, right now, back in the napkin, you're sitting around talking about it. You're like, well, okay, well, it's 2.2 million. The bank's going to loan me 70% loan to value. That's pretty typical. And that's where they start. So 2.2 times 0.7, they're going to lend you 1.5 million based on loan to value. Now, there's going to be a couple other key parts where they're going to hit you on, which will actually push that number down, and that's loan to cost, and it's DCR, debt coverage ratio. So let's kind of stop there. So on the napkin, you're like, okay, I can borrow 1.5 million. So then you start noodling along. Well, what do I think it's going to cost me to build 10 units? And you say, okay, so I'm going to pause on the lender side. And then because you have to really move over and say, well, based on what I know about construction costs, what do I think it's going to cost me to build this building? So then you just keep noodling away. You maybe get out a second napkin and you say, well, what's it going to cost us to build the building? So let's stay with, so Wes, we'll say 10 units, and let's say you're going to build 2 bedrooms, and so they're 900 square feet. So 900 times 10 is 9,000 square feet. And then we ask ourselves, well, what does it cost them to build stuff today, kind of in the apartment market? And I don't know. So maybe we use $120 a foot or so. Everybody's market's different. So you got to, when you're sitting there talking, you're like, well, what can we build this building for? We know it costs, if we're in the custom home space or the spec space, we know what it costs to build single family houses. Apartments tend to build a little bit less for some reason, because there's efficiencies. And so we had 10 units times 900 is 9,000. And let's just say it costs $120 a foot. So that's times $120 a foot. That's $1,080,000 to build the building. Okay. And we thought the bank would loan us 1.5.
Sure.
Okay. So
looking good, right?
Right. So I know you, Brooks, you're going to get to debt coverage ratio and so on. At some point, of course, we'll have to think about what's the land worth, right? Because if it had a for sale sign.
Figure out what the building was worth to build the
we just
building.
found what the building was worth, but the other component is what is the land worth, and then we'll also have some other soft costs. But those, we're talking about our hard costs right now, which is, hey, Brooks is saying what's the building worth, or what's it going to cost to build it, get it up in the air, and what can we?
Well, that's perfect. So we circle back and we say, well, we think we can borrow 1.5. We know the building's going to now cost us 1.1. Of course, we're still back in the napkin, and we've looked at this piece of property, and it could be on the market or not on the market. We don't know, but let's say, in your market, you can buy multifamily units for 25 grand a unit. So let's say this is on the market at 25 grand a unit. It's a 10 unit, 250,000. So now you know what your land costs are.
So Brooks, so you've determined, okay, 250 for the land.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, we're going, okay, that's what they want. And so we said 1.1 and then 250. So that's 1.35. Still going 1.5, they might lend us. But are there any other soft costs or other things that we need to throw in? So we're talking about our 2 hard costs, which are land.
Those are the ones that are easy for us,
right? Exactly.
In builders that we're like, we can figure these out. Yeah,
sure. But what are some of the soft costs maybe that people should be thinking about?
So the soft costs that we usually get stuck with that we don't see in the single family space or the plat development space, the remodeling space, are things like planning fees, park fees, utility fees, which are bigger, fire suppression fees, did I say park fees? So there's things that they load on when you're in the multifamily space that you wouldn't see in the single family space. We've seen more of that in the single family space than we used to. But so your soft costs are typically higher in the multifamily space. And that's why sometimes it's easier to stay in the single family space, because you don't get loaded up with all the planning fees. So permit costs will be higher. And, like bringing, sewer capacity charges can be higher. So there's some of those things to think about. And there's also financing is higher in this environment, because you're borrowing for construction, but then you have a longer build cycle, and then you have a lease up cycle. And so your lending costs are higher. So right now in our back of the napkin, it looks like we have $150,000 of extra money. Well, 2 things are going to happen. You're going to load up with soft costs, and the bank's really going to lend you a loan to cost ratio.
So let's talk about that, Brooks, for a second, because it was easy enough to come up with that loan to value. We had 2.2 million times the 70%, the 1.5.
Right.
So we're saying, well, that's the maximum maybe they would lend us, but you're alluding to the next thing, which might reduce that loan amount.
Correct. So,
Loan
so as you determine what your costs are, the bank will then lend you a certain, they'll make you a certain percentage of loan to cost. Now their loan to cost will be higher than their loan to value. So these two numbers kind of are working against each other, and then they'll loan you a certain percentage loan to cost, and then you'll be governed by the next thing, which is debt coverage ratio. So we'll come to that. So a lot of times the banks will loan you a 70% loan to value based on the value of the building. Then they govern it and say, well, we're only going to loan you 85% of your cost. And that's a pretty typical development number. Sometimes they'll push it up, sometimes they'll pull it down, depending on how aggressive they are. So let's say that by the time we got done with our building, it was 1.350, and there was soft costs for another 200. So let's say 300. So what is that? That takes us to 165.
1.65.
Okay. And they're going to loan us 85% of that. So 1,650 times 0.85, they'll loan us 1.4 million.
So that's interesting. So that's 100 grand, 100 grand left.
200 grand less.
You say 1.4.
Well, it's 100 grand less than 1.5. And this is where we have to be clear about what number we're talking about. So,
right.
So
I think my point was, our point was though, loan to value 1.5, and then, that's a nice number. Oh, now we're at 1.4 based on the fact that our costs are 1.65.
Right.
And they're going to only loan us 85% of that. So now we're down to 1.4 as a maximum loan amount.
This may be a silly question, but as you're talking through this, Brooks, I'm going, well, what's the point of the LTV then if they're just going to work off your costs? Because I'm, as you started going down this path, I'm thinking, oh, well, what if they can loan you 1.5, but if your costs are only 750, then, but really they're going to look at that. It sounds like that cost number, right?
So this is the evolution of lending, and at different times, lenders become much more flexible when they have a lot of cash and they want to push more money out. And so the lender can decide, hey, are we going to give you a loan to value, loan to cost, what's going to govern? But most of these construction loans for small builders like all of us, they're going to come from community banks. And community banks are not going to hang it out there with you. Whereas you might, sometimes you can get a construction loan from a pension fund where they're willing to take more risk, but the community banks tend not to. So loan to value is a good back of the napkin place to start. If the loan to value doesn't work when you're sitting there, having a cup of coffee, talking to the numbers, no use having a further discussion about it. But you just know in the back of your mind, okay, if the loan to value works, we're really going to be working against this loan to cost number, and that's going to govern how much cash we have to put in. And the reason, it will come back to debt coverage ratio in a second, but the loan to cost number is if we have 1.650 is what our costs were, and they'll loan us 1.4. So now we've thrown out the loan to value. So we need to bring $250,000 in cash into the transaction. So that's kind of your point. You're like, oh, do I have 250? Where could I get 250? And you don't even know what your construction costs are yet, but at least you have a rough idea, and you start working against, that number. But then that gets us to, I think we switch off. We've gone through the loan to value, the loan to cost. Things are still looking okay. And then the next governor is debt coverage ratio.
So I think there, Brooks, I don't have to go through that, but so just recognize we're kind of bouncing between our two napkins, right? On one napkin, we've got, this is what our pro forma looks like for the business of this apartment building, which is here are our rents, here's our expenses, here's our net operating income. And we needed that number to go to the other napkin and say, based on that net operating income, this is what the bank will loan us. Oh, does that fit within our cost, what we think it's going to cost to build it? So in a way, the second napkin is your balance sheet. If you think of it that way, your first napkin is your pro forma or your P&L and your income statement, and your next one is your balance sheet, which is how much am I going to have to put into this project? How much am I going to have to borrow for this project, and things like that. So, so all of that then, when we go back to that first sheet, which is your income statement, we worked our way down through net operating income. Now where Brooks is, he's at debt service coverage ratio, which means that if we borrow this 1.4 million, what's the interest rate on that loan and what's the payment? And we need to know that payment, and then we can plug that in below the net operating income. So Brooks, I'll let you pick it up from there.
Okay.
Are you looking for a payment?
Well, yeah. So while I talk about it, maybe just run a payment calculator on this, Wes. Let's say that we're going to borrow. Or I can pull one up.
Yeah, you better pull one up. I don't think I've got one here.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the payment. The payment's going to be based on the current interest rate and the amount we're going to borrow, and then we measure that against what our net operating income is. So let's assume that we can borrow 1.4 million.
Okay. And so what do you think rates are today?
So I would just use let's use 4.5% today. And it's going to be, and the thing that's going to be different is going to be, they're going to use a 25-year amortization schedule, whereas in single family, they use 30-year. So 1.4 million in 25 years, 300 months, 4.5% interest rate. And the calculator I'm using does not like to do that, so I'm going to use a different calculator.
It is a little problem with these online calculators.
I know, it's like,
being set up for single family type.
Well, and while Brooks is pulling up a better calculator, come on, Google. Basically, what I'll try to summarize what you guys have said, which is, hey, we've got the first napkin, we've got our NOI. So I think it was that 110,000.
111,000. Mm-hmm.
And then we've got our costs, and now we're trying to figure out our loan amount. So we're going, okay, depending on what this number comes back at, that's how we're starting to figure out what our cash flow is and our return is. That kind of where we're heading here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brooks, any luck there?
Yep. So 1.4 million with a 25-year amortization, 4.5% interest rate is $7,781.65.
So let's just say 8 times 12. Let's just round up to 8,000. 8 times 12, 96,000. So 96,000. We had 111,000.
Right.
And so right now, if you do the math on that, it's 15,000, right?
And that's per year?
Yeah. So your profit, that's your net profit, is $15,000 a year.
And we're assuming that maybe you had to put $250K of your own money into the deal.
Right. So now there's a lot of different ways that you can figure out whether you like this deal or not. Okay.
Right.
So you can say, well, what's my return on investment? Okay. So that would be your 250,000 that was said so far. 15, and you can say just classic is say 15,000 divided by 250, right?
That's 6%.
How much?
6%.
6%. You say, well, okay, that's my first cut. Is that worth the risk today? Would I want to do this deal on that? So that's one way to look at it. But another way you can look at it is cash on cash return. So how much cash do I have in the deal? 250,000. How much cash will this thing actually push out a year? You say, well, gee, Wes, it pushes out $15,000 a year, which is inaccurate. Because your payment, well, actually it is fairly accurate because we've kind of, we haven't looked at depreciation on this property yet. And we haven't actually looked at the fact that you can't deduct your principal payment on this project either. You can only deduct the interest on your pro forma. So those typical things, but 15% is one way to look at it.
15,000.
15,000, sorry, 15,000.
Yeah. Well, I guess the cash on cash would be different if you, like Brooks mentioned, hey, you might be able to go get the 250 somewhere else. Maybe you have an investor or something. And so
Sure.
your cash is lower, but then your return's probably going to be lower because they'll want to return.
They're going to want to return on that.
It's not looking like this one is maybe a, we're knocking it out of the park, but it could still be a possibility.
But so one thing we haven't talked, so the different things you look at. One, we have to look at debt coverage ratio. I think we should finish that discussion. And then let's look at, equity created. And then there's also tax benefits. So those are all the things that flow into it. Because most buildings are not going to knock it out of the park on a return on investment like this measure in the very beginning. But you might have built that 10-unit building and created $500,000 in equity.
So Brooks, do you mind, let's go back to what you were going to talk about before, which is debt coverage ratio, because all of this calculation that we've done so far, which was we have our net operating income of 111,000, and we know that at least our first cut using Google, it's going to cost us $96,000 a year in a payment. So what is debt coverage ratio, Brooks?
So debt coverage ratio is the bank will typically want 20% of coverage. So they say, if you're paying $100,000 a year in debt, we want $20,000 in coverage, or you want you to be making $120,000 in net operating income, so that they have a buffer. So let's say you take a little bit more vacancy or expenses go up, or so it gives them a little bit of room. So in this case, it's not too far off in that if we had 96,000, they'd want us to have $115,000 in net operating income. So typical thing you do, you push up your pro forma rents and you pull down your expenses, and voila, you've got $115,000. And so that's a good place to start, because we're only off by $4,000.
Yeah,
so
and this is all just back of the napkin, right? They're all estimates
absolutely
anyway, so yeah.
And ultimately, if you make it off of the napkin, which is kind of what we're doing here, we're going, at this point, you're saying, okay, it seems to generally work on the back of the napkin. I do have, say you do have 250,000 cash. The property is at 250, and you think average rents are those. So then you have to ask yourself, I think, and maybe Brooks, there's some other things we've forgotten that we should discuss first, but my thought is, okay, how can I make this a little bit more bulletproof? Okay, here is we're talking about, well, rents have to be just right. The land is priced, just right. It's right at the top of what I would pay. Borrowing right at the top of what I could borrow. And I only have $250,000 in cash. So everything has to align perfectly for this project to go forward. And so then you have to ask, well, what's the risk of though anything not happening correctly out of all of those variables? And so then from there, you can start to work through those variables and go, how can I improve each one of these? So can I buy the land for less? Could I buy it for 200? How desperate is the seller? How long has it been on the market? Was there something I could do with the units to get a little bit more in rent to make it more attractive? Could I find a backup lender, or could I find another source of cash that would backstop me in case I run through my 250 and construction costs go up? So things like that. So what do you think, Brooks? Anything else?
And I think that those are all valid. and a lot of us have to use other people's money to help get these projects started as a way to kind of get rolling. And the nice thing is that most everybody probably knows somebody who is like, oh, I'd like to get a decent return, or I want to diversify my portfolio and I'm willing to invest in some real estate. And maybe you get a couple people that each throw in 100 and you throw in 50, and you're off to the races, as far as getting the project going. But the hard costs are still an unknown. We've done them on the napkin. We think that maybe there'll be some opportunities there. I think every project we've ever done, the hard cost always came in higher.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that the whole velocity issue, right? I mean, because your risk will go up along with the length of time it takes you to do the project. So if you're in your jurisdiction, you can get a multifamily permit in 30 to 60 days. That's a whole different thing than if it's 1 to 2 years, like it might be in another jurisdiction. So your risk factors are way higher in that second scenario than they are in the first one. So you really have to think about that and recognize you need a lot more backstopping. So on the construction costs, though, Brooks and I had a project where, it was in a very inflationary market and over, high regulatory environment. Probably took 1.5 years, 2 years to kind of work through that. And construction costs went up 35%. Killed the project.
And it was probably the highest inflationary construction costs we've seen in 30 years. But that ended up killing the project because you just couldn't increase your rents, decrease your expenses enough to overcome that. And so that was it. Really wasn't market risk from the standpoint of, oh gee, the market went away, but it was construction cost risk, and it was entitlement risk. And the entitlements just took, if we had been coming out of the ground a year earlier, we would have built it for what we originally pro formed it at, but everything moved. And so that's part of building in a strong economy. So if we've always tried to build in down cycles. So if you get everything teed up and permitted and you get ready to build it, kind of near the bottom of a recession, then everybody's really wants to work, and people work for a lot less just to keep their machine operating. And if you've got money to spend, then you can build things for 25% less than you would in an inflationary market. So that's an opportunity when, if you're looking for opportunities, look for stuff when things are sliding down into a recession and be ready to go when the recession's at the bottom, when most people are most pessimistic, because that's what the opportunity is. One of the opportunities.
So you have to be willing to look further ahead in order to see that now I'm in this bottom trough of a cycle, and then I'm going to come out eventually, and this will work out pretty well. But I think you also have to gut check along the way through your project, depending on how long it takes from start back of the napkin to actually breaking ground, and double check on those different expenses, because you don't want to bid this project out, get a number, and then get it to start a construction, say 6 months later or something, and just roll. And all of a sudden your subcontractors are coming back and going, well, it's 10% more, it's this, it's that. You really need to be locked down on your costs and expenses, and do a double check on rents. What's going on? Are the rents, are you still valid on rents? Can you lease it for what you say you're going to lease it for?
So before we get to our example case study here, Brooks, you had mentioned something about, when we were working through this pro forma and we kind of figured out, hey, it's a 6% return, it's $15,000 in cash a year that it's producing. But then you said, hey, we didn't think about equity that you might be building into the deal, or a lot of times these deals start to look a lot better as you look down the road and you've been in them for a while. So how would you guys look at, we just kind of made up some of these numbers along the way just to test this on our napkin, but what would you guys be looking at, into the future, going, hey, okay, yeah, maybe for the first few years it's 6% and it's $15,000 a year, but what are the other things that we can look forward to if we run this?
Well, Wes, I mean, one way to do it is, I mean, you could look at internal rate of return, which most of us, in the residential market don't spend any time looking at internal rate of return. But that, maybe Wes, you explain that, and that would help. That's one way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, one way, we talked about this on another podcast. I think it's just a way to compare different cash flow streams. But all it really does is it says, hey, I'm gonna spend this amount of money at the front end cash, and then my cash is going to come back to me over time, going out into the future. And so you're actually just going to write those numbers down on a sheet of paper and go, I spent 250, and now I'm getting 15 grand, 15 grand, 15 grand, 18 grand, 20 grand. I think rents are going to go up, and you can take that series of cash flows, and internal rate of return basically just discounts those for the time value of money and gives you a return. So you might look at it and go, well, gosh, I got an 8% internal rate of return. That's pretty good, considering that, you can get 0 if you invest with the government today. So
well, but also you can calculate into the typically internal rate of return. You'd have a sale, and you'd say.
Well, that's true. Yeah, I mean, you could do that, right? Yeah, you say a sale at the tail end, so I'm gonna sell it after 20 years, and so yeah, probably where Brooks is going, well, what do you think? What do I think my inflation is going to be on the value of this asset? Our apartment buildings going up 3% a year, 5% a year. I mean, that's an actual return on your estate capital.
Well, I would say, hey, apartments are over the last 30 years have gone up, 3%. So you take this building that's now worth 2.2 million, and it goes up 3% a year, and let's say you're going to sunset the project at 10 years and sell it, and the investors have gotten their return, and they got whatever, they got their cash back plus whatever growth they got, and that's usually what starts kicking real estate returns up from 5 or 6% to 8 to 10 to 12%, because they use that sale and the generation, all that return of equity and growth back to the investors. I think that's where you see these higher returns. If you're never going to sell the building, that really changes that dynamic. So again, investment, maybe you do a couple buildings and sell them, and then the last one you keep, and that's kind of how you work your way from a duplex to a 4-plex to a 10-plex to a 20 unit. And then you're like, oh, I'm done. And then that's.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. But as you were talking about that, Brooks, what if you're never going to sell a building? And that's, a lot of people do that, right? But in terms of trying to compare, you do need to kind of put an artificial sale out there for a couple of projects. If you're actually looking at a couple of pieces of land in your neighborhood or wherever, you can put that artificial sale out at 10 years or 15 years. But the nice thing about, if you're never going to sell, I mean, the reason it's going up in value is because everything else is going up too, right? There's some sort of inflation going on in the marketplace. And so if you had that cash just sitting there and you didn't have it invested in something, you would actually be losing money every year. You'd have the cash, but that cash would buy less every year for you. So that's why we feel like, man, real estate, long-term holds, great inflation hedge. And that can be valuable. The rents are going to go up. The NOI is going to get a little bit better over time. But you got to be patient.
Hey guys, so hopefully you didn't get lost in the numbers there, but we really felt like we wanted to walk through this pro forma in detail so that as we tee up the case study for next week, which is the project that Wes and Brooks worked on for quite some time, we wanted the context of all these numbers and how they factor into the decisions that are being made along the way as you're figuring out the loan amount, where you're getting your initial capital, what kind of return, how you're estimating rents and expenses and those types of things. So we're going to walk through that project on next week's episode, and that will be the actual case study. But this week, go ahead and jump out there, look at some properties, look at some land, look at some rehabs, and bring a few napkins and run through this process. I think looking at that first napkin, again, as kind of your P&L, hey, what are rents? What are expenses? what is that NOI looking like? And then that second napkin, trying to figure out some of your loan to value numbers, your costs, and hey, is this project starting to work out? So those would be my takeaways from today's episode. And again, just teeing up the case study for next week. We wanted the context of all these numbers, so look forward to that. And thanks again for listening, guys. Again, this is Building a Family Business here on Builder Funnel Radio.